Good morning and welcome everyone to this book launch webinar featuring Dr. Lynne Cheney and Vice President Cheney in a conversation about Dr. Cheney's newest book, The Virginia Dynasty, Four Presidents and the Creation of the American Nation. I'm Robert Doar, President of AEI. I'd like to start this morning by reading from Dr. Cheney's opening paragraph. Put the spike of a drawing compass into a map of Virginia at Ferry Farm, George Washington's boy at home. Extend the other leg of the compass so that it reaches out 60 miles and draw a circle. Within it, not only Washington, but also Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe were born, grew to manhood, and made their homes. From this small expanse of land on the North American continent came four of the nation's first five presidents, a dynasty whose members led in securing independence, creating the Constitution, and building the Republic. What a great way to start a book. I've spent most of last night reading it, and it's a wonderful chronicle of four major leaders and the interconnected networks that tied them together at the founding of this country. It is a story that evokes what the historian Bill McClay called the spirit of hope and perseverance that runs straight through the American experience. Dr. Cheney is a longtime member of AEI's faculty, so I want to take a moment to acknowledge how much we all appreciate her scholarship and her intellectual contributions to AI, not to mention the service she's done for our country. This is the latest in a series of several works by Dr. Cheney that examine our country's history with consideration and rigor. Her last book, James Madison, A Life Reconsidered, became a New York Times bestseller in 2014 and shed new light on the life of one of our most underappreciated founders. I also want to thank Dr. Cheney's interviewer today, Vice President Cheney, for his service to our country and great friendship to AEI. I'm so pleased to have both of you here with us for this conversation today, and we will be taking questions after their conversation. So if you want to ask questions, you can email her research assistant at Catherine Quigley, and that's Catherine, E-R-I-N-E with a K, Quigley at AEI.org, or on Twitter using the hashtag Virginia Dynasty AEI. But before I hand things over, I want to say one last thing. A well-treasured piece of AEI history concerns the time that Vice President Cheney conducted an interview with the current Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence. During that interview, Vice President Cheney was polite, but relentless. He asked tough questions that challenged Vice President Pence. It was a great dialogue, but there were some timid souls, not me, of course, who worried that our questioner had pushed the envelope a little bit. Well, I'm sure you will agree, Vice President Cheney, that your adversary today is far more formidable than the one you faced that day at Sea Island. So I want you to know that our view, have at it. Give it your best shot. We're not concerned. And with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Cheney to speak about her new book, The Virginia Dynasty. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Robert. I think you really did lay out the context by reading the part of the preface that you did. And it's where I started. It was just remarkable to me that on this isolated part of what was then a not very important continent, and certainly not an important colony. Well, Virginia was an important colony, but it was, on the periphery of everything. That in that spot, these four men would grow to greatness. And so I think the preface is, as you read it so well, really does set the context.
I agree. Take it away, Vice President, or are you going to go to the questionings now?
Well, I was, usually she has more to say, but I'm
All
sure
right, well, keep going.
we'll get there. No, I was struck too, the thing that Lynn just mentioned, when you take the enormous consequences of what these men did and how they were able to achieve it and what they were part of in terms of building the United States of America and all that it entails, our political systems and so forth. And at the time, it was a real backwater as far as the world goes. And they've circled around what is now Washington, D.C. But at the time, it was, you can't help but think about it as an out-of-the-way spot, and just some remarkable accomplishments for a handful of men who were involved in the effort.
Is there a question?
No. I'm just commenting.
Well, I have to forgive Dick for that because as far as he knew, for a very long time, like 5 or 6 years, I disappeared. And, I was writing away on my book in far corners of the house. And I think you must have wondered what I was doing.
That's been true many times in a 56-year marriage.
I'm going to turn it over to both of you to continue this dialogue, but I did want to say your presence was always felt here, Mrs. Cheney. We knew where you were, and it was a great joy to have your work going on inside our building and with the research assistants you worked with, and your example that you set for everyone who works here. So you may have missed her, Vice President, but we didn't. So
it's a mystery to people who don't write books how anyone can spend 5, 6, 7 years writing a book. But I just love it. I mean, I love the momentum that you build up as you learn more and more of it. And I love the research. Now, the writing I'm not so sure about, but the research, particularly when you have terrific research assistants, as I have had at AEI, it's just one fascinating question after another. And this is what takes me so long, is I go down every rabbit hole, even when, I'm pretty convinced at the outset that I will never put any part of what I'm doing in the book. You have to love, as I do research, and I like writing a lot. But in order to spend this amount of time on a project, and you have to love your subject too.
One of the questions that comes to mind is not only were these men, architects of our tremendous political system and so forth, freedom and liberty and all that's entailed in that, most of them also owned slaves. Mm-hmm. And that was clearly a significant element as we go forward into our history in the 19th century. But how do you reconcile, on the one hand, the architects of our historic political system, with the fact that most of the architects were in fact owners of slaves?
Well, that's become a very big question nowadays, as you see statues of Washington being tossed into the river. I am not opposed to taking down the Confederate soldiers, the Confederate leaders. They were traitors to the Union. And I think that to take those statues down is fine. But I'm appalled actually when statues of Washington fall, or when the DC government has a commission that suggests that if we don't start explaining the Washington Monument and the Jefferson Memorial better, then maybe they should be moved to some other place. They can't do this because those statues and those monuments are on private land. But I'm appalled at this, and the hook for it is usually they were slaveholders. Well, they knew slaveholding was wrong. Jefferson, I think, called it a stain on Virginia, and others of them spoke of it as a moral sin, and Jefferson called it a sin against God. So they were fully aware of the dilemma in which they lived, the contradiction in which they existed, but they found themselves unable. The circumstances were not such that they could achieve the full emancipation that justice demanded. That didn't stop them. Once they understood what a unique place they were in, what a unique time they were in, they were all educated in the Enlightenment, in the Scottish Enlightenment. And the ideas of freedom and liberty and justice and equality, were central to that, the Scottish Enlightenment. And they were all, Washington educated himself, but the other three went to fine schools and learned this. So they were perfectly ready to start a new nation based on the very highest principles. And that's what they did. And, you're right, Dick, it is a contradiction. But I sure am glad they did it.
I'd second that. How long did it take you to write the book?
I'm not sure. Hello? We're disconnected. There you go.
Sounds.
Robert, we have no sound.
The producers would like me to take a back seat so that the two of you can just dialogue. We're all hanging on every word, I assure you. So we can hear every word, the audience can hear every word, but I think I'm getting the cut sign for me so that we just leave it to you. So I didn't want to follow that because I'm enjoying it so much and I feel like I'm there with you, but sometimes you gotta listen to the staff. So I'm backing out so the two of you can engage in a dialogue, and we're all enjoying it. So keep at it. Is that everybody okay with that?
Sure.
Okay, good.
Dick was just about to ask me a very tough question.
Yeah, that's right.
Why did you write the book? Is this when you'd written your biography before on Madison? I know we're very proud of that, and then legitimately so. It was on the New York Times list. But this sort of rolled on out of that experience, the time you spent on Madison.
Well, it was certainly the case that I saw when I was working on Madison how important the relationships were between him and Jefferson in particular. I mean, they were committed to one another for life, but Madison was also, his life was entwined with Monroe's, and everybody's life was entwined with Washington's. I really did quite a lot of research on the synergy of groups. What happens when you have people of fine intellect, well-trained in one place. And it turns out that what happens is that they inspire one another. Their conversations lead them to thoughts they might not have had otherwise. Their disagreements are important. Out of the disagreement, and it was a huge disagreement that Washington had with Madison and Jefferson and Monroe to some extent. Oh, Monroe for sure. Out of that quarrel came political parties. Mm-hmm. Washington thought that the government ought to be run in one way, and that was you elect your politicians and then you leave them alone. And
great idea.
That's right. The voters should go home and just leave the politicians alone. Well, that wasn't how Jefferson and Madison in particular were thinking about it. They really believed that politicians were as a subject to criticism as any other citizen. And that made Washington crazy. So that's when the original divide between Washington on the one hand and the other the three younger men began.
Which one did you most admire?
Now, I like to think of it this way. Which one would I like to have lunch with? Mm-hmm. And, the answer is just got to be Jefferson. You're looking puzzled at that.
I would have assumed it was Madison.
Well, that's different. Yeah. What kind of an experience must it have been to have Jefferson talk about his experiments, or to have Jefferson talk about his theories of government, or to have Jefferson talk about anything? He was such a polymath. And according to one woman who talked to him early in his presidency, he was modest, which really surprised me. She had no idea he was the president-elect. So he would be very pleasant to have lunch with. Now, I think, though, I do admire Madison more. He's steady, stable, not subject to whim. Very profound thinker, the most studious of them all. And plus, he had a wonderful wife, Dolly. She was really an unusual person in her time. She didn't think twice about asserting herself. And, she was how, oh gosh, 3 or 4 inches taller than Madison. And when they went out to formal occasions, neither of them seemed to care that she wore plumes in her turban that made her probably a foot taller than Madison. He loved her extravagance. And I think people generally, loved the incredible way she dressed. She had one outfit that was pink velvet and decorated with many chains. I think it was sort of Moorish. But everyone noted that there were some women, everyone noted how exciting her dress was, but there were some women that were distressed that she showed so much of her bosom. And it was the style at the time. But one woman wrote to another, why doesn't she use a handkerchief? And what she meant was, why doesn't she tuck a handkerchief in her neckline? If you look at the portrait of Dolly Madison in the White House, it is certainly the most revealing. And, Dolly, that's a Dolly. She was just out there.
Interesting. In the current environment, I can't help it but talk about something that's current. The death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg obviously has set up a situation for a apparently fairly bitter fight in terms of picking a replacement, Trump's rule and so forth. There were times when in your book when there were conflicts between the members, but I think most of those of us who've read the history of the era have a tendency to think, well, they were working hard, doing good things, and not spend much time or even be very aware of the extent to which there were conflicts among them. And I wonder how that crew would look at this whole question of appointing a new Supreme Court justice before the election, and one of the first women to serve on the court being replaced. If that doesn't create some, well, I'm just curious how that would have been dealt with by your 4 presidents.
Could I just say a word about Ruth Bader Ginsburg?
Sure.
I think it's been deemed politically incorrect, perhaps, because I haven't heard a single person mention what a sense of style she had.
Mm-hmm.
She was not only a great justice, she a great lawyer, a great intellect. She also had this sense of style. She was always wearing something a little exotic. There's a picture of the Supreme Court members walking down the steps of the building. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg has on a long, longish skirt. And it's so appropriate for that moment. She just had that. So now my politically incorrect compliment. They would have fought just as hard as I suspect our senators and the country as a whole are going to fight. One more thing about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, though, during the Merrick Garland nomination, someone, this is in the New York Times, asked her if she thought that the president should wait and not appoint in his last year before the election, or if she thought that the senators should hold off voting. And her answer was, look, the president is still the president in the last year, and the job of the senators is to vote. So I think it shows the kind of changes that people in public life sometimes undergo. Madison changed all the time. He was the father of the Constitution. He was the man who got the Bill of Rights through. But after he had struggled to make the Constitutional Convention work, he wasn't sure that the Constitution was any good. But within 3 or 4 weeks, he was promoting it. And he promoted it on the basis that, we really needed a more powerful government. in the end, he changed his mind about that too, and became worried about a very powerful central government. There's a British politician, I wish I could remember his name, who said once, he said, "Sir," speaking to someone, I don't know who it was, "Sir, when the situation changes, I change my mind. What do you do, sir?" So, I think that part of the back and forth about who supported what when is just a natural part of politics. And certainly Washington, Madison, Jefferson had a very fraught relationship with John Marshall, who, by the way, had gone to school with Monroe. The world of the late 18th, early 19th century is so little. You keep coming across connections. I think Bernard Bailyn once said it was like a little country of cousinry. Everyone was related to everyone else in a way. So I think they would have fought it out hard.
I was intrigued by some of the debate discussions on the court with talking about Justice Ginsburg's contributions and so forth. A personal friend of mine, of course, was Nino Scalia. We knew each other well, used to hunt and fish together. But I was always struck by the relationship between Nino and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, because they were such opposites in terms of their the positions they represented, with Nino being pretty conservative and Ginsburg being the lead liberal. But they were very close personally, in terms of families and time spent together and so forth. And I can remember Justice Scalia talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg in glowing terms, how much he enjoyed the relationship.
Well, that's interesting. And it always appeared to me, and obviously you were much closer to it than I, that it was based mostly on opera, and their love for classical music. And Justice Ginsburg said at one point, when I go and listen to the opera, the voices inside my head stop. And I'm just relieved of the feeling of conflict and uplifted by it. And I have never heard Nino talk about why he loved opera so much, but I suspect it was probably the same with him.
But the one of the things that you touch on in the book, obviously, is that the extent to which there was conflict between these men who were, in some respects, all involved in the founding of the nation. My feelings, and obviously I wasn't there then, much more current time, but there is a feeling, I think, in the country today that the relationships politically have evolved in a way that it's not what you would expect, or that the feelings between the Congress and the White House, the president, and so forth, that the relationships are pretty severely strained. The battles are pretty significant, and my own sense of it is that just in some 50 years since we first came to Washington, that's evolved in many to a significant extent. That there were periods of time when the relationships were better, friendlier, more collegial, as they often are in the court, than is the case today.
I know, just because I know you, that you had some experience with this, that working across the aisle, and no one ever really condemned you for doing it. But talk about Jack Murtha, or well, he was a significant ally of yours. Jack was a Democrat from Pennsylvania.
Sure. Well, when I arrived here in 1966 to go to work on the Hill the first time, the over the years, good relationships did grow up. I mean, I look back on my time, 4 years I spent as Secretary of Defense, as a Republican Secretary of Defense. My strongest ally in the House, the man that I did the most work with, was Jack Murtha. He was a Marine. He was the first Vietnam vet ever elected to Congress. And he was my closest ally when it came time to put the defense bill together. He chaired the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee of the House while I was Secretary of Defense. And so there were relationships like that that were, I'd call them significantly different than a lot of what we see today happening on Capitol Hill. And I've always anticipated some degree of cooperation among the founders, the collectivity. But your book shows that it was sometimes down and dirty there, just like it was from occasions now in Congress.
I think that the steadiest and probably the most rewarding relationship for both men was Jefferson and Madison. And they didn't always agree. Jefferson tried to undermine the constitutional ratification. He sent letters out to friends who then showed them on the floor of the Virginia Assembly where they were undertaking a crucial ratification, criticizing the Constitution and suggesting that they not ratify it so that, you know, there could be more discussion and maybe some changes that should be made. Madison, as I say, the steadiest of all, didn't get mad, or at least not so that he showed it. He just quit writing to Jefferson for a while. Jefferson was in Paris at this time. So it took Madison a long time to send Jefferson a copy of the Federalist Papers, or the Federalist. And well, I just love it as an example of, you know, Jefferson sort of winging it. You know, I think I'll criticize the Constitution now, or the constitutional ratification. And Madison just holding fast and not losing his temper. I think that Jefferson must have been a very difficult friend.
Fascinating.
Now, it's 11:30. Why don't you ask me a couple more questions, and then we'll go to the questioners on the who are in the chat room.
Well, when we married, you were a PhD in English literature.
This is true.
And obviously you drifted quite a ways away from that once you got involved in history. You spent a lot of time on American history and on political history. I always felt I should have had more history than I did political science. It'd been more valuable and more useful for me. But how did you account for that transition you made from literature to politics, the founding fathers, etc.?
I couldn't get a job as a literature major.
Really?
Yes, I began writing, and there were some very nice people along the way who allowed me to do historical writing for different magazines and outlets. And I wrote history. I just drifted toward it. You know, there's a sense in which I don't think I understood you could major in history. You know, that it was not political science and you could do that. I don't know why. I missed the idea that you could possibly get a PhD in history, but I did. And when I got a chance to start writing, it was really quite wonderful. And this one job I had allowed me every month to go take one aspect of Washington, DC, and describe it, explain it, you know, really get to the underlying basis of it. Subjects from Arlington Cemetery to the columns that are all over Washington, the COLUMNS. Maybe both columns are spelled the same. I don't think so. Anyway, the columns around Washington and why we had all these columns. So it was the kind of assignment that simply whet my appetite. And that's just the direction in which I headed. Would you like to turn it over to the folks?
I would. I'm sure they've got some questions.
But I like yours. Okay.
Robert,
I'm coming
Robert.
back just to say thank you. That was just lovely, and we hung on every word. And to turn it over to Jay, our historian in residence at AI, to continue the questioning and sort of monitor the questioning from the audience. But I just couldn't resist coming back on and saying thank you to both. That was just a wonderful conversation. So Jay,
For us.
take it from here.
Well, thank you, Robert. My name is, for those of you who don't know, my name is Jay Koss. I'm the Gerald R. Ford visiting scholar at AEI. It's a real pleasure to be with both of you today, Dr. Cheney, Vice President Cheney. And we have some really interesting questions. I guess the first one that I want to ask you about is the quality of statesmanship among these men. And I'm really struck that at points in all of their professional lives, they wanted to go home or they wanted to stay home. Washington didn't want a second term. And Jefferson tarried in Virginia rather than take the Secretaryship of State. Madison was back in Montpelier with a wife and a young stepson. Monroe was in Europe and he wanted to go home. But they all sacrificed for the sake of the good of the country. And can you tell us your thoughts on what qualities of statesmanship or leadership that set these four men apart?
Well, certainly a sense of the importance of the task that they were about. It was enormous. It was such an opportunity to build a country based on freedom. And it was an irresistible calling to them. Now, you're right, it also was punishing. And so Madison went home, Washington, whenever he could. But I think it was 6 years that Washington was gone from home during the Revolution. And at one point, Madison spent far more time at a boarding house in Philadelphia than he did at home. And, I think that reflects the feeling that they each had that they were about a great task. And a great task, feeling as though you're part of something bigger than yourself, that was very attractive to them. So while they nearly all went broke in the end, and no doubt that was part of the fact that they had been absentee landowners for so long. There were many, many reasons. But I don't think, if you'd ask them the choice, would you rather have had a life in which you died, well off, than have had a life where you could create a great nation? I'm pretty sure they would have chosen the latter.
Yeah, interesting. So another reader points out that, the sort of network of men that you discuss in your book, right? These four titans of the Virginia Dynasty. There were other networks as well, the Bostonians, Adams and Quincy and the Hancocks. And, you can also look in New York and Philadelphia with Hamilton, Gouverneur and Robert Morris, Philip Schuyler. How would you describe the relationship of these different networks, especially in light of the fact that the Eastern networks were more focused on commerce, while the Virginia network was obviously much more agricultural in its economic background?
Well, they didn't see the world quite the same way. And there's a wonderful quotation. Gosh, I can't remember who wrote it. Maybe you can help me, Jay, in which person A said of John Adams, he's wonderful, he's entertaining, he's smart, but he's half mad. And Washington was appalled when he became commander of the Continental Army and went to Boston at money grubbing. Now in Virginia, you didn't money grub partly because you had slaves who, didn't in the end, slavery just didn't work. In the end, it did not allow for a profitable enterprise, but they were much more polite than Adams was. He was just out there kicking up dust and stirring up trouble.
Yeah. Very well put.
So that's just, one example.
Right.
I think the Northerners and the Southerners from the beginning were very different. And part of the reason that the Civil War happened is that they never really reconciled those differences. And certainly the North could not, by the middle of the 19th century, reconcile itself to slavery.
Yes. What about, can you speak a little bit about Monroe? Because, the first three, the big three, all have these grand titles, the father of his country, author of the Declaration of Independence, father of the Constitution. And Monroe is often underlooked, but your book sort of, by choosing to focus on somebody like choosing Marshall over Monroe, what do you think he added, and what are we, maybe as 200 years later, what have we as sort of society, what have we missed about him?
Well, we missed a lot for a long time because there was not a comprehensive edition of his papers. And there is now. And, so I expect in the years ahead, we'll see a lot more Monroe scholarship. He was such a curious man. He angered perhaps more than any other of the dynasts. Washington had a formidable temper. But Monroe, and one of the people he was angry about most of the time, was Washington. Monroe would sit down and write these scathing letters, memos to Washington, telling him, what a worthless person he was and how he was leading the country into monarchy. This is fascinating. And I don't think we've been able to pay enough attention to it before. But to see this aspect of his character and then realize that despite, what seems like a grievous flaw, this ability to anger so quickly and deeply, he was a good president. He didn't preside over great events like the Louisiana Purchase, though of course he was there at the Louisiana Purchase doing some part of the negotiating. But his achievements were great nonetheless. It was it was Monroe with John Quincy Adams' help that made the United States a continental nation. And the era of good feeling, people always make fun of this description of Monroe's term in office, his 2 terms, was in some sense real. There was a calm in the country, and there was a calm in the presidency. He had the most stable cabinet of any of the presidents. And I think, that's sort of a kind of security and continuity that people felt.
Interesting. Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about the Revolutionary War and how it shaped their character, because all 4 of them participated in some sense, right? Washington and Monroe in a military sense, Jefferson, governor of Virginia, and, fled from the capital, much to the delight of Patrick Henry. James Madison, of course, being as short and slight as he was not cut of military cloth, but was in Philadelphia struggling through the problems of public finance, especially. Can you talk about the ways in which the war shaped their character, shaped their understanding of the Union? Just how did that affect them?
Well, in Madison's case, he could not become a warrior because he had epilepsy.
Right.
And this is a theory that I think I pretty much substantiated in my Madison book. He would simply have a complex partial seizure every once in a while. And as he described it, the intellectual functions would be suspended. And it seems as though he had such an event when he was practicing to be a soldier. He was out on the field, and the story's not told entirely, but it sure seems as though that's what happened. And he then, of course, didn't feel he could serve in the military, and the military probably didn't want him at that point. So that was Madison's story. I think a feeling of being a little left out, but then turning to what he knew best. He began studying governments and constitutions. He was interested in it even as a very young man. And that study became more and more important to him. Let's see. So Jefferson, well, Jefferson spent his whole life trying to prove that he wasn't a coward for having first fled Richmond and then fled Charlottesville. The Charlottesville exit was very humorous in a way for us looking back so far. He basically tried to act like he wasn't worried, you know, and so he went to Charlottesville. He was at his home, I believe, and invited legislators to stay the night and, you know, plied them with food and drink. A young man came to warn him that the British were coming, and he offered him some Madeira. And finally, people began leaving. And Jefferson was certainly one of the last to leave. And he tried to do it very casually. But in the end, he took his fastest horse and galloped away.
Right, right. Very good.
But who did I forget? Washington. Well, Monroe's argument with Washington, and I think with Washington in particular, his big argument was that Washington didn't appreciate what he had done. Monroe was nearly killed at the crossing of the Delaware, taken out of action, not given the commission he thought he deserved. And I think all of those things made him feel as though, you know, Washington was turning his back on him. So the war did that to Monroe and to Washington, of course. It was an opportunity for glory, but it was also a tough slog. And one of the things I've admired about him is that no matter how tough the slog, he conveyed an aura of competence. Not at the beginning. It's very interesting. At the beginning, his troops were worried about his indecisiveness. But as the war went on and people came to maybe understand him better, it was that rock hard confidence, or the ability to appear confident.
Right.
That was very important.
Right. You know, it speaks this idea of projecting confidence just more broadly. All four of them had a very distinct ethos at it. I don't know what the right word is, but their public appearance. And, you know, Washington obviously having to lead men in what was a very difficult, you know, situation. But, you know, even Madison, you know, one of our viewers writes in and points out that Madison participated in college debate societies. You know, he was in the Whig Society at Princeton, and prepared them in ways for public life and how they comport themselves in public. And, you know, in this age where I personally am so chagrined by seeing politicians just pop off on Twitter all the time, just with such a lack of decorum, is there a way that we can recapture that, particularly preparing, you know, young people for engagement in the public sphere and expectations of what it means to participate in those? Because the Virginians certainly had very distinct a sense of public dignity, which seems to be lost today.
Well, I do think that the atmosphere in Virginia encouraged men from a very young age to participate in public service. And so when they were 24, 25, 26, when they were very young, they became members of the House of Burgesses and took part in actual legislation, and, you know, saw older men who impressed them greatly. So I think that helped them. Probably we shouldn't overestimate the amount of composure and politeness that they, you know where I'm going, that they later demonstrated with their debating societies, which often involved very raucous lyrics that you would not want repeated in front of children. So, you know, they had a lively time at Princeton, as well as learning a great deal from a great man named John Witherspoon.
Good. A question for you, Mr. Vice President. So, Thomas Jefferson was, among his many accomplishments, was served for 4 years as vice president. How would you assess his tenure as vice president?
Well,
He didn't do a thing.
I don't think he did much. He did get squared away, set up, so to speak, to be president.
No mean achievement.
No mean achievement. And I think, just speculating, that is a hoped for outcome for an awful lot of my predecessors. Not many of them made it.
No.
But it's there's a sense now that that it's taken on more significance and so forth, and that the job's is a legitimate job. I mean, you're earning your pay, so to speak, and I think that's true in the last back probably at least to John Nance Garner. But that's an interesting question. I don't think of Jefferson as vice president, and the way I thought of myself as vice president, But the history is such that it's clear that the job didn't amount to much for an awful lot of the people who held it over the years.
Right. Well, and I guess as a follow-up, of course, because Jefferson became vice president, having finished second in the Electoral College to John Adams. If you could re-envision American history in a way in which the second place finisher in presidential elections becomes vice president, how would you react to that? And it's another way of saying, do you think the 12th Amendment was an improvement?
I don't know. That's an interesting question, because I think most recently, obviously, Harry Truman, and what a tremendous president he made. Even though he was the haberdasher from Missouri, and his involvement, though, when he took over, his lack of, Roosevelt hadn't really included him in anything in the period of time when he was vice president, and he came in and ended World War II, won the Cold War, and got it started in a significant sense. I mean, Truman was, in my mind, a Democratic, but a strong president. And it was his time as vice president that really set him up to perform that task on Roosevelt's death.
I have to just interject a note here, because it always makes me laugh. The vice presidency, from the beginning, was an afterthought. In order to establish voting in the very first instance, as you pointed out, everybody just ran as a pack. And the person who got the most votes, as long as it was a majority, was president. And then the person who got the second number of votes was the vice president. And that was really an afterthought. The question was, well, what are we then going to do with him? We've got this vice president now what? And so they could only think of one job. They gave him the presidency of the Senate. And they did that largely because they wanted to keep him out of trouble.
Right.
I like being sure Dick remembers that story.
No, I remember when I was the president of the Senate.
Yes.
I had to sit up there in one of the chairs in front of the House chamber when we had joint sessions.
Didn't you cast a tie-breaking vote at one point?
Oh, yeah, 7 or 8 times.
Ah, interesting.
I was busy.
Yes, you were.
Well, we're just about out of time, but I have one final question, because we talked a lot about the history of these men, and especially in your questions, Mr. Vice President, talking about contemporary politics, and it's I think everybody agrees this is a very unsettled age, difficult times for our country. What do you think would be maybe 1 or 2 lessons that the Virginia Dynasty we today can take from to sort of guide our politics moving forward?
Gosh, they were a raucous bunch, fighting with each other. They were smart. That may be a very important element. Jefferson was smart in a kind of flighty way. Monroe was smart in a kind of practical way. He looked at other people like Madison and said, how do I succeed in the way he did? Washington had kind of innate natural intellect. And I think that kind of attitude, that kind of interest toward intellectual issues helped make them successful.
Actually, I do have one more question, a late arrival, somebody's running late. So they asked, what do you think about the musical Hamilton and the way members of the dynasty are remembered therein?
Well, I loved Hamilton.
Yeah.
We saw it a long time ago when it was still off Broadway. And I had heard about how excellent it was. So I got us tickets, had the hardest time in the world persuading Dick to go to a rap musical. But then he did, and he really admired it as well.
Fantastic. Yeah.
I can't, well, I thought Washington was well, if humorously done, but Madison was the one I found most disappointing. Now, I know you weren't even supposed to try to look like the fellows that you were impersonating, but Madison was kind of a big old hunk of a man who, walked bent over. And that seemed to me so far from, that one caught my attention. And I thought I might have changed that a little bit.
Right. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. This has been such an educational, enjoyable opportunity for me to speak with you. And based on the questions, I think our viewers enjoyed it. Good luck with the book, publicity. Just best wishes to you both. Thank you so much.
Thank you.